Welcome to Brain Wellness, the podcast. I'm your host, Mandy MP. Each episode will bring you a new topic or interview related to brain health and wellness as part of my mission to help you on the path to a healthier, happier brain. So, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. My guest today is Michael Wyand. Michael is CEO of Oxeia Biopharmaceuticals, a clinical stage biotech company developing new innovative therapeutics for mild traumatic brain injury and related neuro-metabolic dysfunction. He earned a postdoc in comparative pathology at Harvard Medical School and a PhD in comparative pathology at the University of Connecticut, and has held leadership positions at a number of companies such as Epirus Percivia and BioAssets Development Corporation. Michael uses his medical background and business experience with hope to bring relief to the millions of Americans who each year suffer from head injury. I am so excited for our conversation today. Thank you for being here, Michael.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be on.
Yeah.
I'm passionate about concussions, so it's a good place to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. As we were talking a little bit before we hit record, concussion has definitely become a passion of mine over the last couple of years after my own experience. So I always like to hear from my guest perspective. Tell me a little bit about your story. How did you get into this field to begin with?
So both my boys played, and my daughter played sports in high school, and my one son went on to play in college. And I watched them on the field of play. And I was always, I think like a lot of people that had not specifically gotten into concussion, they're more concerned about a catastrophic spinal injury, or they're going to blow out their knees. And if I saw my sons and daughter get up and seem to be okay and they stayed in the game, I thought that was, kind of okay. And one of the folks that I worked with in several of the companies had founded Oxeia, and in 2017 approached me and said, would I be interested in joining? And, with the experience of the kids playing sports, my experience playing sports, and with all the information that was starting to accumulate, I got interested and signed up. And then, started talking to concussion sufferers, people that had all different types of causes, whether it's athletes that we usually think about, whether it was military people, whether it's people that just fall off their bike. And then I started looking around. I realized there's no therapies. There's a lot of physical therapies that certainly you can get at a post-concussion clinic, various terms of occupational therapy and cognitive therapy and emotional therapy and pain for headaches and other things, but nothing that was really directed at what's going on with the injury. And when I began to realize that there was such an absence of development, it really got me geared up to try to push this forward. And clearly there's been a lot of help with the various foundations and the things that we know now about concussive injury. Although I still see, there's that crazy sport called slap, where people stand up. And it's just odd to me that this day and age, you try to manufacture concussions just if you were a healthy individual.
Yeah. I think there's still a lot of lack of knowledge in just the general public, not even just the medical sphere, but just the general public on what a concussion is and how to get it and what the long-term effects are.
Exactly. Well, what happens with concussion is you get a direct blow, which something hits your head, or you can get an indirect blow. And by that, I think the typical term would be whiplash type injury, where your body stops short, your head continues to move in a direction, and your brain, when your head stops, your brain bounces against the inside of your skull. And those types of injuries you see, especially in football, are very obvious when you see that. A lot of neuro injuries and other types of diseases, a neurologist will do an exam on you, and they will try to determine what part of the brain has been injured. So they want to, the way your mouth and your nerves work and all those things. But concussion, what happens is when you do receive the blow to the head, either direct or indirect, shock waves go through the brain and they stimulate all the cells to what we call depolarize, which means a nerve cell produces electrical impulses that make it do its job, and that cell fires off electrically. So all the cells in your brain fire off at the same time. And what they do is they decrease the available energy. They burn the energy out in the brain almost instantaneously when they all fire. It's like completely draining a battery. And so you'll see the athlete on the field who's been hit before. They were vibrant, running around, all active. They get hit, they go down the ground. And often you'll see them do this clenching of the fists. Their arms will be tight. They'll be lying on the ground, and you'll see them tremble like this. And that's actually part of the depolarization event, where the brain's actually going through that firing. And that goes pretty quickly. And, then they're ready to try to stand up. And as they start to try to move, nothing works. The brain has been completely depolarized. Nothing works. They don't know where they are. They can't stand up. They do a variety of things. And depending on the significance of that polarization event and the significance of the hit, that may be total lack of being able to operate, or it could be, just a focal, not a focal, but it's just a couple of symptoms that you have, depending on the severity. So it's a very unique injury in that it doesn't have a lot of structural damage. So if you get a concussion and you go to the emergency room and they decide to take a CT scan, they're not going to see any damage to the tissues of the brain. The reason they take the CT scan is because they're concerned if there was a blood vessel that was bleeding from the injury, and in the beginning it might not show a problem, but if you let it bleed, and especially if you went home and fell asleep, you'd have a big blood clot in your brain. That could be very severe. So because I think, and that's what I think made people think that it wasn't probably much of anything to worry about. When I played sports, if you got hit in the head and you could stand up and stay in the game, your coach thought you were committed, your teammates thought you were a tough guy, the fans thought you were a hero, and you'd go back in and play, which is just the opposite thing of what you want to do.
Right.
If you twisted your knee and you were having trouble walking, they knew they had to get you off the field, get an x-ray, find out what's wrong, because they didn't want you to re-injure that or injure it further, so you wouldn't be available to play the next game. The knee was a very serious injury. The head was, okay, you're all right. And I think that's what, for a long time, nobody saw really a good reason to develop a therapeutic for it. Even though in the early days they had this term punch drunk, or boxers who towards the end of their careers would develop these, cognitive problems. They'd call it punch drunk. So now we know the work that's been done in the past 10, 15 years, we know the consequence of even a single concussion, but certainly multiple concussions. We know the effects on cognition and dementia and things that occur. We also know now that CTE, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is really scary, has been identified as a consequence of repetitive head trauma. And we're starting to see a lot of it it's only able to be diagnosed by looking at the brain after a person passes away with it. But we're starting to, and Chris Nowinski is the head of the Concussion Legacy Foundation in Boston. He's doing a lot of work with BU, who's maintaining the brain bank that he uses to study CTE. And just that brain bank is expanding and it's getting into younger and younger populations. So we know how severe it is now, and now is the time to start to do something about developing therapeutics for it. Often when we go out and talk to people about running our program, and that includes getting the science all lined up, ready to go, but also raising money to be able to do the funding. The people who are doing the funding, the venture capitalists and folks like that, and other institutional investors, when they want to understand more about our program, they can't go to the FDA and say, well, let me look at the last 5 concussion programs you had and see why they failed and see what they tried to do. So there's an absence of information. And what we found is that even the endpoints that you would use in a clinical trial, those really have not been validated to satisfy what the FDA is looking for in the endpoints for concussion. One of the reasons is because there's no test for concussion. It's not like you go and get your blood pressure measured and it says you have high blood pressure. It's really looking at the patient, the way they feel and function. And that's very common actually with neurologic diseases. There are very few specific tests for neurologic diseases. But nonetheless, we have a series that we use in our studies that is a 22 symptom scale across cognition, emotional effects, and physical effects. And those 22 symptoms have been used extensively by a number of people who run studies. But the FDA wants some specific validation work done so they can determine that those symptoms are exactly matched up with concussion and that the patients interpret them and perceive them the same. So that's one other thing we're going to do before we start our next trial, is do that validation exercise on the endpoint.
Yeah.
Our drug, the injury, I talked about, the injury and the depolarization event, but there's another part to the injury, which is as the brain is moving and bouncing around in the skull, it's kind of a malleable, soft organ. It's not hard. And that can create stretching injury. And in most cases, the wiring between the different nerve cells, there's axons that connect the wiring. It's like a computer chip in a way, the brain. When those stretch, they're not actually being broken in most cases. They're just being stretched. They actually then are not effective in transmitting the electrical impulses the way they should. So that affects pathways in our brain that can affect our emotional state. It can lead to depression. It can affect memory formation. It can affect cognition. And so that's the result of a lot of the longer term symptoms as well. And the effects across everything the brain does is that stretching injury. So our approach has been, when I joined the company, the team at Oxeia had been in contact with Daiichi Sankyo, a Japanese pharma company, and they were working with a small peptide hormone called ghrelin, which is a naturally occurring hormone in our body. It was first identified as the hunger hormone because it was recognized to be the main hormone that stimulates our hunger. And then subsequent research showed that its full neurometabolic effects are way beyond just hunger. So it's produced in the abdominal area and in the GI tract tissues, and it goes into the bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and goes into our brains. And it does a number of things, which one of its main things is it increases energy production and energy availability. And you can imagine that if we're talking about a draining of the battery, we need to get new energy in there. Because one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that 20% of the energy that we burn every day is burned by our brain. We tend to think of exercise. If we want to get more calories burned, we got to move, we got to jump, we got to run. Maybe we ought to think more, study more.
Right.
In fact, I wish I thought of that when the kids were younger. I would have told them that.
Good
Yeah,
idea.
want
Yeah.
to get in shape? Do your
Yeah.
homework. But because it's using 20% of your energy, it's very important to get it functioning again. You need to get that energy in place. And what happens is, because the brain is always functioning, you can't turn your brain off. It's doing things we don't think about all the time, like making us breathe, making blood go through, making our heart pump to make our blood flow through our bodies. You can't shut it off. So when the brain continues to spin, it's like an engine or electric motor who's spinning without appropriate electricity. It can damage the motor. And so one of the effects of not being able to establish the energy soon enough to your brain is that you start to get reactive oxygen species that cause toxicity and degeneration of the nerve cells. And then that leads to longer term symptoms. So the ghrelin molecule goes into the brain. It's the receptor. It causes increases in energy. It creates a UCP2 pathway, which decreases reactive oxygen species. And all that neurometabolic support supports what the injury is all about, so that you can then reestablish normal function. And in about 80%, 70 to 80% of the people that sustain a concussion, within 3 to 5 days, they will be back, reasonably well back down to their baseline with maybe just a few symptoms, occasional headache. 20 to 30% of the people, and it's been reported to be even higher than that, will develop persistent symptoms. And if those folks, they're in a difficult position because they don't get good guidance from the medical community today about what to do. And we found in our trial in this persistently symptomatic population that it took about 23 days for people to get to the post-concussion clinic. That was the average. They were showing up a month after their injury because no one really knew to tell them to go to folks who are used to doing that. And when they get there, all they have is the physical therapy routines of cognitive physical therapy, visual therapy, auditory therapy. And, they can treat the headaches and other things with drugs and balance issues. They can do those things. So the second part of that stretching injury, the ghrelin molecule, is pretty amazing. It actually causes outgrowth in the connections of the wiring of the brain. So, and there's another term called plasticity in the brain, which means, I always use this example. If I'm looking at you right now, I could turn my head away and I can remember your face and your glasses. I can remember things in your room. If I keep thinking about that for the next couple hours, by tomorrow, I could think about it again. It would be in my short-term memory. And then if I thought about it a little bit more that day, it probably would be in my longer-term memory, which would be days to weeks out. How did that happen? There was a path, just by looking at you and turning my head, there was a pathway that formed in my brain. So the brain is constantly, with all these signals that are going around, constantly forming new pathways and going around pathways. So if you've got injury to stretching injury, your body can sometimes adapt to the negative part of the injury. So it starts to, a normal pathway that make you feel happy is not available anymore. So you go around that and you get a pathway that, well, I don't feel so happy.
Yeah.
So it's important to be able to get that wiring back as well. So I think we're excited about the ghrelin molecule that we call OXE103 because it can really hit both the energy metabolic component of it as well as the outgrowth and repair of the pathways. And so it's, the brain is kind of a new frontier. We know the heart, we know the kidneys, we know much everything else, but the brain, and I tell people it's like I used to say the brain was a boring organ because if you're a pathologist and you look at it under a microscope, it's just dots of cells and it's just nothing happens, nothing moves, right? There's little blood flow, but it's the most amazing organ because of what it does. And it's just that we haven't had the ability because it's in the skull and it's not available for a lot of evaluation. We just haven't had the time to sort it out. But I think there's lots of energy now to try to figure out some of these neurologic diseases because there's some of the frontier things that are going on that really have unmet medical need. There's just no good solutions for a lot of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's fascinating that we've gotten so far into medicine and identifying what's going on in the body, and we haven't yet figured out what's going on in the brain. I think that's why I like it so much. I've
Right.
spent 25 years essentially in brain work to some degree, and it's always fascinating to see. And as my patients come into my concussion clinic, there are similarities, but it's not cut and dry. It's not a cookie cutter. I can't say, well, what's going to work for you is going to work for the next person that comes into my office. So then I'm always curious where we come up with the ideas for these biotech things or research in general, like when we're trying to figure out what's going on and how we do things. How do we isolate things like the ghrelin molecule? How did that come to be?
But this is where, when we talk, a lot of times you'll hear the abbreviation R&D, research and development. Um, and we know that universities and, well, there's academic centers all over the country and all over the world, and they're researching things and they write papers and they go to meetings and they discuss things, and they're brilliant people and they do all that and they move the information and the science forward. And that's really where the ideas come from for, drug development and biotech. What we try to do on this, I didn't go down that pathway to make that my career. I decided I wanted to take that scientific information and make practical applications. And so that means there's going to be now a meeting and a discussion and an exchange between the research people and the development people. The development people are going to look what the researchers are doing. And when they get something to the point where there's enough understanding that the developers can see a path forward to make them into a product, then what generally happens is you license that technology from the individual academic research center that discovered it. So in our case, the ghrelin molecule was discovered by a professor doing research in Japan, and that technology was licensed by Daiichi Sankyo to start developing it. And as I said, they were starting to look at the hunger. In those early days, they were looking at the hunger part of it. One of our founders, Dr. Vishal Bansal, is a trauma surgeon, and he was looking at ways to improve outcomes from his trauma patients that had traumatic brain injury. And he became very interested in the gut-brain axis. And it's something that we hear a lot about today. We hear about how all the bacteria in our GI tract are helping produce molecules that make us healthy and make us who we are. And there's a lot of impacts between the vagus nerve and other nerves that attach to the GI tract that can affect the way you feel and think and all types of things. And he was fascinated by finding out where there was different therapeutic approaches that he could apply to his traumatic patients. And he came across this molecule ghrelin, which at that time Daiichi Sankyo started working with. And it was pretty clearly part of a gut-brain axis produced in the GI tract, responsible for, and if you think about it, what it's responsible for is hunger stimulation, which increases the acquisition of energy. And then that energy is transferred in, and the ghrelin goes to the brain, and it causes the mitochondria that make the energy, increase. So it's all part of that axis. And then he was in a hospital situation, obviously, but there was also doing some research because he was associated with the University of California at San Diego. He started doing animal models to look at how animals who had concussive injury would respond to the drug therapy. And he saw some very good results. And that resulted in the formation of Oxeia. And then Oxeia was able to license the program in from Daiichi Sankyo, and we were able to move down the road. One of the unique things about our license is we were able to license all the data that Daiichi Sankyo had developed. And so they did 9 clinical studies, 4 phase 1s for safety, 4 phase 2s, and 1 phase 3. They were looking at anorexia nervosa and cachexia, a wasting disease associated with COPD. But all that, and they did 70 preclinical studies for preclinical toxicology. They manufactured the ghrelin molecule, and we were able to get access to all that. So when we went to the FDA to show them that package, they said we were able to go right into concussion patients and run our first phase 2A study, which we did at the University of Kansas Medical Center. And we saw a very robust response in the treated patients, 85% responder rate versus on standard of care, they were kind of just very little improvement. So it was definitely a signal that was encouraging to us and the community of our advisors, who are largely researchers who are following it, that we should move forward with this next trial, which is going to be a larger phase 2B trial.
Okay. Yeah. So what kind of results are you seeing with it?
So what we are using is a 22 symptom scale that's called the post-concussion symptom scale. And that's the scale that we're going to take to the FDA and go through their validation procedures and use that in our next trial. It has symptoms that the patient grades from 0 to 7, and it's across cognition, how they think, whether they're feeling foggy. It has emotional questions of sadness or anger or other types of things that they might have. It asks them how they're sleeping. And then it has them grade headache, whether they're dizzy. So there's 22 of those symptoms there. And when we did our trial, we looked at all of those 22 symptoms, the severity of each of the scores, added them together for a total number. But we also looked at each individual symptom to see whether there was an effect on a small subset of the symptoms or whether all the symptoms were affected. And we saw that all the symptoms, the 22 symptoms, there was not a single symptom that was not affected. So there was not something that stayed bothering the patient and didn't improve. And we didn't see anything that was, was different between those responses. So that was good news, because the FDA, when we had our first meeting with the FDA, they said to us, if you want to develop a drug for concussion, you need to demonstrate that how the patient feels or functions in relation to the specific disease that they have. So if you just treat headache or nausea, we're going to give you an approval as a headache drug or nausea drug. If you want to get approval for a concussion drug, you got to demonstrate that the symptoms that patient developed immediately after their concussion is associated with that injury, you can treat. So we were happy to see that effect from the ghrelin molecule. It had that effect that we wanted to see. So we'll bring that forward into larger.
Very cool. How long did it take to start seeing some of those changes?
We start to see a big we treat for 14 days. And I'll say here that ghrelin is in that same type of family as the GLP-1s, these small peptide hormones that regulate neurometabolic processes or metabolic processes. And of course, the GLP-1s, every time we know that, they were developed for diabetes, and they noticed the decrease in weight, and that's gotten everybody fired up to take GLP-1s. And now almost every day in the newspaper, you see some other potential indication for GLP-1s that's being reported. And it's because these small peptide hormones, these signaling hormones, are affecting metabolic processes that, especially in the brain, are very, very relevant. And the ghrelin is part of that whole type of signaling system. But if you look at the effect, so we treated for 14 days. It's an injection, subcutaneous injection, like GLP-1s, like insulin. People are very able to do that at home. It's not a problem. And what we started seeing a big separation between the two groups by day 8. So, and I've talked to a lot of people about, because the brain and the plasticity of brain, all things that we talked about. And if you look at, for instance, psychiatric medications for depression and other types of psychiatric disorders, it takes a while for the brain to react, start to make those pathways change before you see the effect. If you take a migraine medication, you expect 2 hours after taking the migraine medication. That's going to be the endpoint where you look at the success of how did it take care of my headache. So we were very happy to see it happen at day 8, about a week after we started treatment. And then we followed patients out to day 44, and the treated patients were still on the improve. They're improving their symptoms. Their symptoms are getting reduced and reduced. We had a quality of life tool that lots of times when you do symptom testing, you want to know how important the symptoms are to the patient. So you ask questions about their quality of life. Can they take care of their kids? Can they walk? Can they do their normal daily activities? Can they work? All those types of things. And we saw the same type of improvements in the quality of life as we did in the reduction in the symptom scores. So it was very interesting. When I started working in the field of concussion and at Oxeia, very focused on the acutely injured athlete, and that requires treatment probably within the first 24 hours of injury. And we weren't as focused on the chronic injury until we started talking to the folks at Kansas University Medical Center. It turns out that it's very difficult to recruit patients after a acute injury. If you're in the emergency room and you're there for 18 hours, you've had a head injury, you're scared, you're not sure what's going on. You're in one bed, you're here, they do this, they do that. They finally take their CT scan. 18, 20 hours after you've been there, they come and say, oh, good news, you're CT negative, you've got a concussion, we're going to send you home and you can rest. If your study coordinator who's at that site goes up to that patient and says, can you stay another 2 or 3 hours while we explain to you about this trial and try to consent you to participate? They're saying, I'm out of here. Maybe call me tomorrow or the next day or the next week. I'm out of here. So difficult to recruit. And we start talking to the post-concussion clinic, and those folks have been now around days, had their concussion, they're not getting better. They may have seen their primary care doc for a visit, maybe a second visit. Things haven't really happened. Not a lot of good guidance. They start to become scared. They're having a lot of troubles at home, or if they're the stories I've heard of high school kids getting ready to take their SATs, trying to apply to go to college, and they got injured in soccer or wherever, and they're not able to do it. It's so sad. It's just such an important time of their life. But those patients who are persistently symptomatic, we wanted to catch them within 30 days. So between 7 days and 30 days, we would expect those patients to come get treated. And we're trying to prevent the onset. There's a term that they use called post-concussion syndrome, which is for folks who have been affected by concussions and are weeks to months to years out. We would love to see, as we treat patients, that there is no more post-concussion syndrome. I mean, that would be the holy grail. And
Yeah.
then what we plan to do, one of our advising groups is Jerry Grant is head of neurosurgery at Duke, and the concussion group at Duke has seen our data, and I've gone down there. We work closely with them. They suggested that we could move closer and closer to the primary injury, like we do the injured athlete, by doing things like taking that emergency room patient, saying, "We've got this trial, we've got an interesting opportunity for you to participate. Why don't you go home and we'll contact you tomorrow?" And then seeing and moving closer and closer to the time of injury, because I really do believe that our ghrelin treatment would be really nice to use at the time of the injury so that you didn't have to go 3 to 5 to 7 days to figure out whether you were going to be okay. Why wait to be treated? And I think the earlier you treated, the more effective you'd be at getting everything rewired and back to normal from an energy perspective. So
Yeah.
that's but you got to get, when you do development, you need to pick one patient population that's you can identify and is uniform, show that the drug works there, get that approved, and move on to maybe other and expand the label to treat additional patients.
Yeah. So what I see in clinic is that patients aren't getting to me until months later after their concussion. So it's not even in that 30 days. So at some point, are you then going to try to expand past that 30-day mark?
Yes, we'd like to expand into because of the cognitive effects of ghrelin and the rewiring is data. Well, Daiichi had some data in ALS. There's data now out there in Parkinson's disease. The neurodegeneration occurs in Parkinson's disease. We'd love to open up small trials in those indications. And then look at the dementia that can be associated with repetitive head trauma that a lot of the athletes have, but even forms of brain fog that people get just naturally with the aging process. It'd be very interesting to try ghrelin there. So we would love to be able to expand into those areas. As I said, I haven't talked about this yet, but because concussions have historically been looked at as a injury that not that important, not that important as compared to other parts of your body. There was more focus on the moderate and severe brain injuries to look at treatments and to run clinical trials. And concussions were ignored. So there was very little work, if any, done in concussive injury. And since I think around 1995, 2000, there were like 30 trials in severe traumatic brain injury and moderate brain injury that were run and failed, unfortunately. And when I would go out and talk to investors about raising money to run the program, they would say, "Well, all trials fail in TBI. Why would we invest in your company?" I said, no, those aren't concussion trials. Nobody's run concussion trials. And so once we got people to start to realize that, then you look and you see with all the foundations, Brain Injury of America, Association of America, there's a whole host of different groups. They've raised the awareness level, so we now know it's important. But now we start to do the work, and when the investors want to look at your company, especially in the biotech or pharma space, they want to understand the science, they want to understand the likelihood it's going to work and all those things. And one of the places they go for information is they go to the FDA, because if you want to develop a cancer therapy for lymphoma, you can go to the FDA, and all the different documents for all the companies that have ever tried and developed drugs successfully for lymphoma are there. So you know how to run the trials, what the endpoints are. None of that information is available. So, the investor will say, "Well, we think it's a really great indication. We really like what you're doing, but keep us posted. And as you get your next trial done, give us a call." Well, we don't get to the next trial if we don't raise the money for it.
Right.
So it's been a challenge to get people to raise the funds to do the trials. We've been successful to this point. And we're actually talking to a group that raises money through crowdfunding. So we may open up a round in the crowdfunding space. Because as I said, I talk to people on the outside, they want to know, when is it going to be developed? Can they participate? What can they do? And let's get this going. It doesn't really matter what venture capitalists or other, investment groups think about it. Let's just get it going. And I think, but from what we've talked about, on this program and what's available in the literature, the ghrelin molecule makes a lot of sense. It matches up very well with the.
Yeah, yeah. It actually makes a lot of sense because a lot of patients have their appetite affected by their concussion as well. And that's not really something that's talked about much. And I wonder how much that ghrelin molecule has to do with it. My own injury as well as that. So when I had my concussion a couple of years ago, I lost my appetite completely for a long period of time. So I'm just curious how that potentially could have helped me or other people like me that do lose that appetite, so you can't even get the energy in.
To do with the stretching injury to those nerves that are in that area. And then, the other component that affects longer term sufferers is the fact that the when the neurons in the cells start to get deprived of their oxygen, there's degenerative effects on the cells with the reactive oxygen species. You get inflammatory responses, and there's a cell specific to the brain called glial cells that is responsible. They act like inflammatory cells. And when those cells start to multiply in the areas of the brain where the stretching injury occurs and where the degeneration has occurred, those cells actually deprive the neurons of oxygen because those cells multiply. Now they're eating up all the oxygen, and so the cell in the middle of this inflammatory response doesn't have oxygen. So you can get this persistent symptomatology. So if you have, a problem, for instance, with nerves and going to a particular part of the face or structure, you could imagine that if there was any inflammatory response there, it could perpetuate that problem. So if you can start to get the neurogenic properties of the ghrelin molecule, it could be potentially helpful in being able to get those nerve cells out of the scope of reactive oxygen species and out of the scope of the stretching injury that's occurred.
Yeah. Yeah. So what can be done to move research and development forward?
So right now for us, it's come down to funding. We're raising funds, as I said, through the crowdfunding to do the next phase 2B trial was 160 patients. And that will be a trial that will use the endpoint that we will have pre-approved by the FDA. And we have a consultant who spent 30 years at the FDA in the endpoints group, and she wrote the guidance documents for validating a patient report outcome, which is what we're using. And so she's working with us. She's seen our data. She's very excited about the data. And we have a contract research organization that does these studies. It involves interviewing patients and seeing how they perceive concussion, see how they perceive the symptoms. So we need to raise the funds to get that done and then get that next trial done. And if I had funds beyond that, I would go. I've had conversations at Harvard and down at Duke. They would love for us to give them drug supply. And then their researchers there can design a trial in Parkinson's disease, in ALS, and look for a sign of activity. And if that is a sign of activity, then we can take it, or other companies could even take it in different indications and move forward with it. So, but it does require this. It's unfortunate that the development work and the work that we have to do for safety and efficacy to understand the drug. It's a lot of clinical trials, a lot of work, and it's very expensive. So, the numbers are staggering. It's like $500 million to $3 billion to develop a drug. That's the cost of it. And you've got to get you have to be able to fund that innovation. And then you have to be able to keep your investors happy by making progress. So we're excited to do that.
Yeah, that's a lot of hoops to try to
Yeah.
jump through to get that out there. Time frame wise, how long does it take to get through all those phases to get it out to use in the general public?
So our next phase 2B trial, based on and you mentioned this, the number of patients that you see later versus earlier. So when we went to the post-concussion clinic, we were talking to Dr. Rippey, who is there at the University of Kansas Medical Center. He was telling us about the number of patients he sees. It takes a while to drill down and realize that if we're trying to recruit them within the first month, well, there's a lot of patients that, don't fit that. So it's a smaller number, and you winnow the number down. But we're hoping that we can recruit the 160 patients at 10 to 15 sites. So we're going to be looking at 10 to 15 sites in the country in 1 year, and we'll follow them out. I think we're going to extend the follow-up this time in this trial out to probably 60 days. And then we'll take that trial and go to the FDA. The next step in the standard way to develop drugs is once you run your phase 2 trials, then you're ready to run, if they're successful, then you run 2 phase 3 trials, the same identical trial. And if you get positive effects in both of those trials, then that's what you submit to the FDA for approval. In our case, the next trial we do, we think is going to be the same design and the same drug dose and the same everything that would be in the approved product. So we may be able to ask the FDA to consider it as the first phase 3. But that means that, a year to do our phase 2B, another year to do the phase 3, if you do the second phase 3, that's 3 to 4 years out before you're going to complete those data packages and get that data. So it's a long process, but I think it's a very good process that we have steps that, guarantees, guard safety and guard the thing that we want, aspect that we want effective therapies to be available.
Yeah, yeah. It's good to do the due diligence so that we know that it's a good drug and it does what it's supposed to do. So I get that. It's just frustrating from a clinical standpoint to say that, oh, it could be several years before I could get my patients on
Right.
something that actually helps them. But I'm the kind of provider that looks for the why. Like, why are they having their symptoms? What is keeping them from getting better? I don't like just giving Band-Aid medications to cover things up because it's not really fixing the problem. It's just kind of putting it behind a door. We're closing a door and we're not going to look at it anymore. And it's not helping the patient in the long run.
We had a lady on our website who gave a testimonial. She had lived in Virginia, had gone down to Florida to look at a house. When they came back from looking at houses, she tripped on the rug in the real estate agent's office, fell face first into the desk, then bounced off and went backwards and landed on the back of her head on the ground. And she was unconscious for a while. She got brought to the emergency room. They admitted her. She had woken up, I think, a minute and a half or so or something like that. They admitted her. She was able to get in contact with her husband. He was concerned, obviously, flew down. She was by herself. She's scared. Her head's injured. It's just horrible. And they told her they didn't want her to go back and get on an airplane to fly back for a week. So they stayed in Virginia for a week. And then she got back to Virginia, and she just describes this feeling of no one's giving you like any information of what your prognosis is, what you should do. It's not a positive feeling that you've engaged the healthcare system and you're off on a track now where you're going to hopefully expect something. And someone told her, finally go to a post-concussion clinic. So she went to the post-concussion clinic, and the doc there said, do you have squirrels in your backyard? She said, yes, I do. He said, well, I want you to sit in a chair, look out the window, pick out a single squirrel, and stare at that squirrel without taking your eyes off it wherever it goes. And that was the physical therapy for eye tracking.
What?
I thought to myself, I mean, it sounds like it could work. It's a good idea, but it's just not. Is that where we are with concussion treatments?
Oh,
Find squirrels in your backyard?
it sounds like caveman treatment, but okay.
Yeah. So she did get better, but she's somebody who thinks that there's got to be, some more attention paid to it. So
Yeah.
I think, so we need 10 to 15 sites so we can get the trial recruited in a period of time that will, come in without taking too long a time. But it's probably, we expect maybe 2 patients a month in a particular site to be able to recruit the trial.
All
So
right. All right. Do you have any upcoming events or projects related to this or others that you'd like to share in addition to that?
no, just we are going to be starting our validation work and opening up our crowdfunding rounds. And we've got some papers being published and so forth. You'll probably see them. So there'll be a bigger social media push for us to get people interested in supporting the cause. And I think we're expecting that to happen mid-October. So
Okay.
that's not too far out.
Yeah. Yep. And I'll be glad to help share any of that too with my audience because I think that it is a good resource and a good place to put your funding if you're looking at putting money towards something. This is a valid
Yeah.
one.
It's like I said, when I talk to people, I've given talks, the room is filled with people who had a personal experience. And when they stop and think that this injury's been around forever, it's almost the most common injury worldwide, serious
Mm-hmm.
injury. And there's no treatment for it and there's been no work in it. It's like a head scratcher. So I said at one of the clinics, which turned out to be kind of a faux pas stumble. I said, doing this work and developing concussion drug is a no brainer. And I stopped and thought, so, well, maybe that's not the best thing to say.
Yeah, though it is very important though. So I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Where can people find you if they want to follow along and see what's coming up?
OxeaBiopharma.com. That's our website. And there's a lot of additional information on the website. And then there's an info at oxeabiofarma.com, which is an email. If you want to send us an email with further questions, always happy to chat with people. And I think the concussion, the way people perceive concussion and the impacts on their lives is definitely helpful for us because it shows how important this is, the unmet medical need. And it also gives us a sense about how the patients feel and respond, what happens in their daily lives, what things trigger it, what things are this, that helps in all those things help in the design of clinical trials. So the more information from this patient group is very helpful for us to do the work we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. I will link those in the show notes as well so people can find that easily. I know you're on a couple of the social medias, the LinkedIn and X as well. So I will include those also in the show notes so people can find you. Phenomenal work, fascinating work. I love and I look forward to seeing what the results and everything come up as in the next steps of the studies. Any last words of wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners as we close up today?
No, I think to all the sufferers out there, I think we're trying to get something across the line to help you. I think the post-concussion clinics are doing good work, even though I didn't want to minimize their effect. They have all kinds of different physical therapy that is effective. And I think you should try to hook up with one of them, because when you get there, you're going to find people who understand what you're going through. They're going to be able to put you through some routines that'll help you. And, they'll always be there for you because they're pretty passionate about what they're doing as well. So rather than sitting around in a dark basement trying to figure out what's going on, get out and contact a post-concussion clinic. And they're pretty much all over the place in major hospitals and sports medicine clinics. And I'd like to thank you for the podcast, Mandy, because I think this is the kind of thing that gets the word out about what's going on. Since these drugs are not available, no one's aware that some of this work's going on. So I really appreciate the opportunity talking to you and your community.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of this. It's great to know that there are things being done. And I think the last couple of years have been really kind of key for concussion, as there's a lot of research coming out. Even this year, the information about trying to reclassify those levels of concussion. So we're not even talking about mild, moderate, and severe anymore, because that mild concussion, mild TBI, the information that we have now looking at the long-term effects. And I can even say, too, from my clinical patients, the patients that have come in that have survived severe brain injuries are almost doing better sometimes than those that have had the mild TBIs, those concussions. So just kind of seeing that in my practice has been interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, that's interesting because, it's not mild.
No.
I mean, for the person who's injured and by the next morning feels okay, or just was a little bit dizzy when they got hit, had a very, very, very mild concussion, you could say they're mild, but
Yeah.
that's not the case. And we know that a lot of these things. One last comment: some of the people, there are these proton magnetic spectroscopy assays that are not really practical for using as in the clinic. They have shown that even with a what I'll call a mild concussion, the neuro-metabolic profile does not go back to normal until 90 days post-injury. So if you look at that, especially in the sports world, you wouldn't want to have a concussion, even a mild one, even though you feel better, and go back to banging your head against the wall. That just wouldn't be a good idea.
Yeah.
So
There's
it's
so much
like
coming out.
it's serious, and there's more things coming out, and that's good, because then we'll be able to take that research information and that interaction I said, talk about between research and developers. We can start to bring more candidates forward, and there are more companies in Oxy starting to do things. We're at the phase 2 point, primarily because of the data package we got from Daiichi Sankyo. It meant that we didn't have to do all that earlier work on the drug itself. It was already all done. So there's going to be more coming. It's just a matter of getting everyone in the communities to support it and make sure that people realize this is something important to be done.
Yeah. I look forward to watching all of it and hopefully at some point implementing it into my general practice. So
You're on the front lines.
I am. So thank you again, Michael, for being here
Thank
today.
you very much, Maddie. Good talking to you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this with others to help me continue on with my mission to help people live healthier, happier lives. Go to www.brainwellnesssolutions.com to see what I'm up to and get links to all the social medias there. See you next time.